You are listening to www.integralnaked.org.
I, like so many of us, I'm sure, have been really moved by this. And for me, there's a double challenge, not only the extraordinary amount of suffering and evil in the world, but the fact that my own life has been so unbelievably privileged and fortunate and free of suffering. And in the face of that double whammy, all I can do is kind of, usually my first move is intellectual, but in the face of that, all I can do is move back and investigate first principles. And as far as I can see, there's nothing that I can do except first is to practice, and to practice first gratitude and for my own good fortune, and second the practice of relieving suffering as best I can as a second response. And that brings up two very fundamental koans, which I'm sure around which I'm sure all of our lives revolve. First is, what can I do? And the second is, what's the most strategic thing I can do? And those are koans, and I think the difference between a koan is a wisdom question. A knowledge question is something we can answer once and for all time. A koan is a question we keep asking, and each time we ask it, it takes us deeper into ourselves and into reality. And in the face of those two koans, what comes up is the challenge of two kinds of work in the world and work on myself. Work in the world is looking at, one can clearly work on any different any quadrant or any level, but I think for us one of the key questions, as in response to what's the most strategic thing I can do, is, okay, what's the deepest cause of suffering and evil that I can identify? And clearly, it's not just that there is suffering. It's that in some way that if we look very closely, all the great suffering is a result of, has psychological and spiritual roots, which means that the most appropriate response is going to be not only just to feed the hungry and to reduce harms, but to look at and heal, understand and heal the psychological and spiritual roots from which those crises and sufferings have come. And for us in this room, that clearly one of our major responses is through helping with understanding. And I think perhaps the primary understanding which we who are blessed with this integral gift want to bring is the understanding that any partial or suboptimally developed perspective which assumes it's the whole is going to create totally unnecessary and well-intended and therefore terribly tragic suffering. And in response to that, we try, what I think we're about here in an integral community, is to try to bring the gift of a larger perspective. And that brings us back to the work on ourselves, because clearly our capacity, the scope of our perspective is a function of the depth of our being. And the depth of our being is a function of the amount of work we've done in ourselves, which brings us back to spiritual practice. And the spiritual practice which calls to us is clearly one which involves work in the world. And as long as we're working in the world, we might as well use it as part of our practice, which calls us to karma yoga, or to awakening service. That is, to use our work to relieve suffering as the very means for our own awakening, and therefore enhancing the effectiveness of the only vehicle we have, which is ourselves. And so we come to a karma yoga blessed out of this integral perspective, with the goal of attempting as skillfully and effectively as we can to bring that blessing to the world.